This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Randy Lovejoy. Randy is a pastor and author who writes on the Substack channel MakeGoodHappen with Randy Lovejoy, where he shares stories and resources that attempt to explore Christianity from fresh perspectives. He wants to push the conversation about church beyond traditional church boundaries and explore the challenges and opportunities for Christian thought today. We are going to be discussing the decline of Western Christianity and how Randy thinks we can faithfully respond to it. Randy, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this ever since we first connected, and can't wait to talk to you about all this. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I first found out about you on the Faith Ventures podcast, which is run by Norman Horn, the founder of the Libertarian Christian Institute. And I thought you did a great job of just presenting your case on that show. And so I wanted to have you on. Before we get into our conversation, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Well, I think one of the funny things, kind of on the face of it, I'm a good candidate for the FBI's most wanted poster in a sense, because I'm white, I'm male, I'm a heterosexual Texan, child of a man who worked for an oil company all of his life. I have a nuclear family, wife of 35 years, 2 sons. So many of the characteristics that I think, at least on in LA, are kind of suspect in a lot of ways. Like, I don't know, can we trust you or not? But at the same time, as people have gotten to know me, I've lived in the West and the non-West. I've lived among the wealthy and the poorest of the poor. I met my wife in Mexico. We dated in Honduras. I was ordained in Mozambique, in Southern Africa. I pastored a big steeple church in South Carolina. I was solo pastor of an urban multi-ethnic church in Los Angeles. Then I was middle management with the Presbyterian Church in this part of LA. And now I'm officially in the Presbyterian Church. I'm officially labeled an evangelist online with this Substack platform. So my life has kind of embodied the adventure of following Jesus across a lot of our boundaries and the way that we think about things. And so, as a result of that, I guess what I really see myself as is a participant in this story of the promise fulfilling that started with Abraham in Genesis 12:1 with that invitation to, leave what you know and go to a land I will show you. I like that too. It's not like go to, 35 degrees latitude, 12 degrees, or go to this particular city. It's just like, hey, just leave what you know and go to where I'm going to show you, and I feel like that's been a key part of my journey is like, oh, here's the next step. Okay, now we go, I was at Fuller Seminary. It's like, oh, we want to go to Colombia because my wife and I speak Spanish. And it's like, no, actually, we're going to Mozambique where they speak Portuguese. Okay. But it's a real joy and adventure to follow the Lord in this kind of way. And so that's, I think that's a big part of my life is that as unexpected shifts, turns, and changes. But what really unites it all is just following Christ and really, okay, what's the next step? Where do we go now, God? And being open and willing to go wherever that is, even if it's, now we've been in LA for 20 some odd years. That's the longest I've ever lived anywhere since I was little. So, just that willingness to, hey, where do we go next?
Yeah, I love that. And you have been in ministry for a really long time. And I was in ministry too for about 8 years. My audience knows this. And when you're in ministry, it's very formative for you. It definitely changes your perspective on the world. It changes your perspective on humans and human relationships. Like it's a challenging job in a way that a lot of people just can't quite understand unless they do it. And you've been in ministry in several different cultural contexts. So talk to us about your experience in ministry. How has that shaped you? How has that, I guess, develop the trajectory of your life?
Yeah, well, I think the sweet spot for me has been to be on kind of the edges of the institutional church, but in a way that I was, kind of trying to help the church in new ways and to think about things out of the institutional box. And what I mean by that, there are a lot of people out there that really think we need to revamp Christianity as a whole. I completely disagree, and I don't think I'm smart enough to make it better than St. Augustine. I'm just not willing to say that, or than Wesley, or there's a million people that it's like, hey, I'm thankful for what they did, and I would like to follow in their path, but we've got to think out of the box in the West in terms of the way the West has done Christianity. And I've been able to do that both within the institution in the West, but also by being involved in the non-West and really seeing what does it mean to be, say, a Presbyterian in Mozambique? Well, guess what? It's not the same as being a Presbyterian in South Carolina or being a Presbyterian in Los Angeles, though there's some similarity. The overall institutional structure is really different. So that's been the real sweet spot for me. But I will, like you said, it's also a very formative time. So when I started as a solo pastor, this was after my first, I had 5 years as an associate in South Carolina, and then became a solo pastor of a church in urban LA. And so we had to make some changes because that church had been in decline since the early 60s. It was, running low on steam. I was hired to be the redevelopment pastor was what I was hired to do. And so we started making some changes. And anybody that's in a church, even the just committee members in a church know change is hard for a church. It's like, well, my Aunt Flo sat in that pew, and if you dare change the pew pad, I'm going to be super upset about that or whatever. Well, here's just a little bit, just for people that may not know what pastors have to go through. One Sunday, fairly early on in my ministry in Los Angeles, we had a great worship service. We baptized a kid from one of our families. It was good worship. We had communion, all that. So I was super happy. And then I got up to my office like maybe 1, 2 in the afternoon, just after taking a little break. And I got this email. So I'm just going to read this to you real quick. Okay. It says, Randy, there should have been a rosebud on the altar Sunday, which should have subsequently been delivered to the family whose child was baptized. That used to be a deacon function, but several deacons told me that it's not their job anymore. Whose dumb idea was that? Don't say the deacon's dumb idea. They assure me it wasn't. Also, bluntly, my opinion is that the sermon was too darn long and said the same thing too many times. Randy, when we have communion, can't you cut us some slack and plan for a shorter sermon? I mean, you want to shave off 30 seconds by doing away with the choral benediction, and you want to have liturgy? Never, and certainly not on communion Sundays, but you can't slice 10 or 15 minutes off the sermon at least when we're having communion? All of your predecessors since 1984 have done that, and they can't all be wrong or all going in the wrong direction or be worse speakers than you. So it's okay if they shorten their sermons, even though your words are too golden to clip. Come on. No offense. I like that part. No offense.
Yeah.
But that's just me. You want to hear an absence of bull? Come straight to me. So that's the kind of stuff that, in different forms, pastors run into, especially if you're called to bring about change. And for a while I thought, well, I must be a bad pastor if I can't get people to follow me. But then I talked to a consultant and he said, wait, you thought that church redevelopment was easier than church planting? He said, you're wrong there. And you thought that everybody would just follow you? He's like, when you start making change in redevelopment, you will get this pushback. That is part of the whole redevelopment process. So I had to really develop, this is one of the quotes from my father-in-law, who's also a pastor. And he just said, Randy, the tendency when you get stuff like this is to have a thin skin and a hard heart. He said, your job is to have a thick skin and a soft heart. Let that develop as you get junk like this thrown at you, and you'll be a good pastor. And I always thought that was really wise advice. But, a lot of this ministry in the U.S., many churches are in a lot of dysfunction and decline, and there's a lot of worry and anxiety. There's a lot of frustration with society as a whole. And it just, pastors and other church leaders that, dare to stand up tend to become lightning rods for all of the frustrations of the people that they're working with. And it's tough stuff. And it's not just pastors. I was talking to a pharmacist and she was like, yeah, I went into pharmacy because I really wanted to help people, but they always attack me. I'm trying to just give them their meds, and it's not my fault the doctor did something wrong, but they're all grumpy and in a bad mood and they attack me. I just wanted to help people, you know? And so I think a lot of people in ministry just have to get past the I just want to help people into, wow, this is serious stuff and this is going to be hard work and all of that. So that's been my experience of ministry in the US. And I actually, I think overall I found it less contentious to be work cross culturally than I did as an American in U.S. churches. That was a big challenge. So I mentioned that email because this is actually in the first chapter of the book that I'm working on right now. That'll be published by the end of the year, and that's kind of where we started off, just to let people know that if they're struggling with church, a lot of us who've been in ministry know exactly where they're coming from. So.
Yeah, you made a point that the church in the Western world, at least, is in a state of decline. And that's something that I think a lot of us have felt for a long time, especially being in ministry. And I could tell over the time that I was in ministry that there was a major shift in culture that made Christianity a lot less relevant for the average American. And I just think that that's true whether you're in Europe or North America. Western Christianity is in a really bad state of affairs. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, because a lot of your work is trying to address the decline of American Christianity, trying to find helpful ways of overcoming it. But I think a lot of people are struggling to diagnose the problem. So what are some of the reasons or the factors that you think have contributed to the decline of Christianity in the Western world?
Well, there's a lot of ideas out there, but and that's actually what my next book's all about. It's called Outside of the Church, Inside of the Faith, to try to help people that are struggling with the institution to figure out how to keep moving forward in their spiritual journey with Jesus, while they're trying to figure out their relationship to the church. Because I'm just meeting more and more people all the time that have been very committed to church, and then something blows up or something, and they're struggling to stay involved, but they're not sure what to do. And so, I think there's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of things out there, some true, some I'm not sure I agree with, that to try and diagnose the problem. But to me, the most helpful thing I can do is I think we need to reframe what's going on in the Western church as a global and phenomenon within the history of Christianity. To a macro view helps a lot with figuring out what's going on. And what I mean by that is there's a scholar named Andrew Walls. I'd recommend anything that guy's written. But he talks about the serial nature of the church in a chapter in one of his books. And he makes the point that what you see as you look through Christianity is Christianity becomes centered in a certain part of the world, then it starts to flourish, and then it's shared with another part of the world. And then what tends to happen is the new place that it's been shared starts to flourish and become the new center of Christianity, while the old center starts to decline and become more of a minority faith. So, for example, you could look at, say, Coptic Christianity in Egypt. If you go back to the 2nd century, Egypt there was some serious Christianity going on there, and Origen, which some people have heard of, was a major, he had a seminary in Alexandria, was a major theologian. It was huge in Egypt. But today you go there and there's this little Coptic church that has a connection to that time. But in a lot of ways, they just react against any new Christian movements that are coming in as a threat to them. And they're very much in the minority. And you can look around, even if the churches that are in Revelation, right, they're all in Turkey. Well, how's the church doing in Turkey? And how's it been doing in Turkey for the last however long, right? So the point he makes is there's this odd thing, because like Hinduism, broadly speaking, started very early on in human history, but it really hasn't moved much beyond where it started. There's kind of trendy Hollywood versions of it, but really the real stuff is just, it is where it is. Islam tends to grab spots and hold them, except, say, Spain, which was Islamic for a while. But most of the areas that Islam takes over, they hold. But then you got this odd thing about Christianity, is that it flourishes, shares, and then dies again. So to pull that back into the Western church, what I see is that we're in that downward part of the cycle because we had this great missionary movement that really shared the gospel. There's all sorts of amazing people from the past that were a part of that movement. And now the church in the non-West is really flourishing while the church in the West continues its decline. And so to me, the first point I'd want to make with anybody is the Western church does not determine how Christianity is doing on the planet. So don't worry. It's not like Christianity is in danger. I think right now, the last I read, they think that, 3 out of every 8 people in Africa by 2070 will be Christian. So and if you look early 1900s, there were very few Christians in Africa. I mean, it was a tough place. So Christianity is shifting, and we're in that shift, and we're in the difficult position of the decline, watching the decline happen. But that doesn't mean that Christianity's done by any means. What it does mean, though, is that we need to develop a strategy. I mean, I've worked with church revivals, go far enough back when revival was a big thing. And all we need to do is revive the congregations, and then we'll start growing again. And then it became revitalization, which was sort of a broader kind of scope of if we just revitalize our congregations. And then it was, let's redevelop our congregations, change how they function and their connection to communities. And we've been through all that. And a lot of consultants have made a lot of money off of those things. But if you look at the overall, it hasn't done anything to change the trends, the negative trends of Christianity in the West. So all that to say, we've got to think way out of the box in terms of how do we approach this, given what's happened historically, given that, like you said, there's so many cultural forces that are pushing people away from Christianity. So it's not just about getting a healthy church. I mean, that's what I realized. I was at the church in LA for 13 years. We changed over the leadership. It was a younger leadership, a lot of U.S. recent grads from University of Southern California. We were multi-ethnic. We had life. We had great worship, but still people from the community weren't coming. And it dawned on me, they're not looking for a healthy church. It's like, that's not their problem. It's not like, oh, if only there was a healthy church in Silver Lake where I was, we'd go. They were a lot more steps away from participating in any kind of Christian community. And so, we've got to think out of the box, maybe going back to, like, I think in some of the areas I've worked in LA, I think little house churches are a much better way to go, and try to just seed a bunch of house churches in the community with people that already know each other, that are exploring their faith. But it's going to take a lot more time. We're not going to be able to afford paying staff probably, which again, in Africa, that's not a big deal. In earlier Western Christianity, you got a lot of, tent makers, as they call them. You got lots of those. But for us, that's kind of like, well, wait a minute, I need my medical and pension. So how are we going to pull this off as a pastor? And it's like, well, I think that model may not work so well, except for some of the mega churches. We have an increase in mega churches, and that's great. Fine, go for it. But I think for a lot of churches, it's not going to be that model anymore. So I hope that answers what you're asking. But yeah. I think that's what I can bring to the table, is just that broader historical picture that I think helps us to then say, well, let's learn from the global church and the church through the last 2,000 years and find things that make sense in our context now, given that we are in a time of decline, and then start trying to work toward, work our problems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that was a great setup for the rest of what I wanted to ask you today. One of the things that I've noticed is that there are a lot of people, and I graduated high school in 2007. And of maybe the 20 or so kids that were in youth group with me, I think that there are only 2 of us that regularly go to church at all anymore. And the other one listens to this show, you know who you are. So I'm glad we're in this together. But all of the rest of them have just completely left the church, or it's become a very marginal part of their life. They might go on Christmas or Easter with their family, but they're not involved in discipleship. They're not involved in a community. And another thing that I've realized is that for a lot of people that were in my circles earlier that decided to remain in the church, they've been through the process that has been labeled deconstruction. So they've deconstructed their faith, and maybe if they still go to church, they go to a very progressive church. And a lot of the people that were in my youth group that just left the church altogether have also become political progressives. Now, I do think that the Democratic Party throughout the 21st century has done a very good job of marketing to young people. And so I do think that that's a part of it. And people can easily substitute their faith for a political identity because in a lot of ways, those things can be interchangeable. But I wanted to get your perspective on that. What do you think about this trend among younger evangelicals to deconstruct or to walk away? And why is it that all of them seem to move to the political left?
Yeah, I think, I think part of it is that it's exciting. It feels like you need valor and courage to head that way. And I think that's one of the funny things about, like, say, the other side of the spectrum, more conservative, is in some ways, at least culturally, it just feels like you're kind of like going to hang out in a rocking chair with your grandmother and make sure that she's got a blanket on her. And I love grandmothers. I'm not knocking them, but and they need their blankets. But no, I think that's one of the things is that we're looking for adventure. We're looking for something that calls out virtues like courage and honor and willing to go against for the sake of those in need, those types of things. And I do think that's where the progressive, the more progressive agenda really calls you to that. It challenges you. Are you willing to break with family? Are you willing to break with, friends who don't believe this? Are you willing to go out and march about this issue and show your face? So it does all of that. The thing that's sad to me is that, and this is my point of view, and I'd love for people to argue against that with data. I don't think any of those, like any of the big movements that we've had since even like, what was the Wall Street one going way back?
Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, Occupy. Yep. None of them, as far as I can tell, have done anything to change society. They're all like, it's like we have this big to do and everybody freaks out and all of that. And then it just goes away until the next one. Oh, now the next thing, which now it's the whole Israel Gaza thing, which has been around for a while, but now that's the big thing, and, it'll last for a while. And then I wonder what's going to be next. But it's just, I would think over time, if people are really interested in making a difference, like actually making a difference, that they're going to eventually realize that, yeah, this is calling for valor from me, but for what? This isn't getting us anywhere. And I think that's one of the reasons older people tend to move more conservative, I think, over time. You've got many people that started out more, many people that are in their 80s now that started out Marxists. And then over time, they were like, wait a minute, this doesn't work. So now what do I do? This isn't getting the results I thought it would. I took a stand and it's not going there. And so they begin to move to a different place over time because they're looking for something that actually makes a difference. And to me, that's where, again, if you go back to just to Western missionary Christianity. And again, Andrew Walls is a great place to start with reading about some of the stories. But you find people with incredible courage and incredible valor. I know that missionaries get a lot of bad stuff out there, and there were bad missionaries, but there were also a lot of amazing, incredible missionaries who were so gutsy. And so that's where I've found that desire to be courageous and to be called outside to something that, really gets your blood moving, and it's saying, all right, I'm going to take a stand for Christ, but it's not like a rebel without a cause kind of thing. It's more like, I want to figure out how to go and create a life that is going to, and this is where the Substack name came from. I want to create a life that's going to make good happen in my own life, but also among the people that I'm in deep relationship with and my local community, because I think that's the other thing, that one of the reasons that a lot of the deconstruction stuff is just so ineffective is that it's always about macro issues that have nothing to do with our everyday lives. Yeah. So that means we can't have as much of an impact. But I think that's baked into it because it's the people that are in a position with more power. They want us to support them so they can have the impact we desire. But what we really need is, what are the local issues? What's going on with your neighbor? What's going on across the street? Get involved in civic issues in your local community. That's where you're going to be able to make a difference and where you're going to actually see change happen because you show up. And, some of the, at least around here, some of the neighborhood meetings, if you want stuff that's, that will shake you up, go to a neighborhood meeting. It's not an easy thing, but it's just like, I think that's the thing is this, I hear people using deconstruct more and more. And it's just like, that's the other part of me is like, I don't want to deconstruct, for example, Christianity. Do I think I'm smarter than like all of the people that came before in the last 2,000 years? I mean, I remember this Christian book on redevelopment, and it came out. It's very trendy for a time, like a lot of those books are, and then it ends up on sale for a cent on Amazon. But it had this chapter called the 1700-year wedgie, and what they were was just that for 1700 years we've forgotten what it was to be the church, and it's like, okay, you've read no church history at all, right, because there's like tons of people that remembered what was going on with the church. But it's just these kinds of statements that are, just ridiculous. And it's like, why do we think we can deconstruct whatever it is in a better way than Aristotle, or in a better way than, whoever you want to pick, but there's so many highly impressive people in the past that for us to say, oh, I'm going to deconstruct it and make it better than it ever was before. It's like, read Jonah, realize that there's a bigger story going on than your opinions, your thoughts. We're part of this much bigger story. And guess what? We're not the center of the universe. We're just not. And then figure out how you're going to contribute to the world. And then you'll get to something that will call for courage and that will actually result in something good. But that's pastorally, that's the thing that makes me the saddest is I'm watching people set up their lives in a way that I know down the road, they're going to be like, wow, I put a lot of energy into that and nothing happened. It didn't change anything. And there are going to be a lot of sour older people, I think, if that's all they've done. But again, so I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, that was great. Now, I really love the image that you used of church is kind of like going and sitting with your grandma as she just like is trying to stay warm underneath the blanket. Excellent metaphor. Yeah. And I think that gets at one of the many problems facing American Christianity. I know for me, when I was younger, I was very fortunate. There were a very small handful of people that really pushed me when I was a teenager to read my Bible and to engage in mission and discipleship. And because I had a buy into my faith, that's the reason why I stayed. But when you go to a lot of churches, a lot of the times it just feels like a social club that you get anywhere else. There's nothing unique about the church experience. That's obviously one very major structural flaw in American Christianity. But what are some of the other larger structural problems that are facing Christianity that are unique to American culture?
Well, I think because we have large facilities, that many of which were built in the 50s or before, and so they have huge needs. We have less people. The people that are serving are older. The world isn't set up anymore for 9 to 5 work hours. So our whole setup on how we run the church is out of alignment with the way that life is right now. And on top of that, we have all these additional problems financially. So what tends to happen is that the churches are anybody that's willing, they throw them into committees that are doing financial work or administrative work or, even like worship. We put so much, do you know how much it costs to have handbell choir? It's insane how much it costs, and to keep them polished and to use them 3 times a year. So we've got all these expenses that used to make sense, but now they don't. And what happens is, I think, is that we're sucking the life out of especially younger people that come into the church and want this adventure. And what do they get instead? Hey, join a committee, and it's like, Okay. Really, that's what you got for me. So here's what I would recommend for folks. Okay, for families, number one, for families in the like around I think it was in the 19th century in England, one of the big things that people did is they had home worship led by the parents, and you do worship with your kids, and you figure out how to do it, but you do that. Number one, if more homes would just from day one have worship with their kids every morning at breakfast, read them from the Bible, and there's a lot of cool, anime almost kind of Bibles you could get that'll catch their attention, but plant the seeds of the scriptures as a family. Help your kids understand why worship matters as a family. I think that will help them then. It kind of inoculates them against this idea that if they can't find a church that works for them, then they're done. Or if they can't find a church that doesn't just want them for a committee or want their 10%, then they're done. Because they've started to realize Christianity is more than that. Christianity's part of everyday life of a family, that kind of thing. And then the second thing I'd recommend is find, kids, teenagers especially, find one mentor. It's kind of like what you said, but find a mentor that's willing to just walk through life with you as a Christian. It's all you need. You don't need a whole church. You don't need, all you need. And this is what I saw, like with my oldest son, the church we went to, thankfully, had a few people that were great mentors for him. And so what that meant was when he went to school at NYU, which isn't necessarily conducive to Christianity, you're odd if you're a Christian there.
Yeah.
But he actually tried the campus groups, but those didn't work out. And he ended up finding a church that was exactly what he was looking for. But he made the search for that because he knew from the mentors that he had that, no, I'll find a place that's going to work. I just have to keep looking, and I'm going to find that place because he'd experienced living Christianity. And I think that's part of the problem. A lot of the people like your friends that grew up, my guess is, I could be wrong, but my guess is that they grew up in the institutional church with the parents, getting them to church and feeling like that's their major duty.
Yep.
And then when they were in church, it's boring. You feel that, wow, things aren't right. It's dying. It's declining. You can sense it. You've got a lot of really old people and you're like, where are the 40-year-olds? Wow, where did they go? And so by the time you go to college, you're like, that's just not life-giving to me, And so I want to go somewhere that's life-giving. Then you run across, oh, we can deconstruct this thing. That's how I can deal with it. And, oh, yeah, there's all of these live issues that are so alive and people are arguing over and I can get involved in and I can stand up for it. So I think so to me, it's really important to have all of our young people come to understand that following Jesus isn't about an institutional church. The institutional church it's meant to facilitate that, yes. But it really is about something that's personal, something that's family, something, at that level. And there are other people who can walk you through life from their experience about what it means to be a Christian in a lot of different just everyday life situations. One other story that might be relevant. I remember at one point we had a lot of 20-somethings and a lot of like 70-year-olds in the church that I was pastoring. And there was this one major moment when we got all of them together and the 70-year-olds assumed that the 20-year-olds just wanted them to go away. And the 20-year-olds said, what are you talking about? We want to know you better. We want mentors of your age that have been through life and to talk about these issues and how do we do life? What have you learned? They wanted those relationships. But we had to actually be intentional about that because there was just otherwise, the 20-somethings thought, well, the 70-year-olds don't like us because we bring coffee into the sanctuary or something. And then the 70-year-olds are like, well, they don't like us because we like choral music and they don't, or whatever the issue is, but we had to actually bring them together and help them to figure out, no, we actually need each other and we want each other. But that needs to happen at the level of relationships, not at the area of let's change the institution. It's got to be personal. It's got to be, hey, can I come over to your house and do that kind of thing. So sorry, I kind of meandered a lot in
No,
that,
that
but
was
I think
great.
those are some key things. So.
Yeah, no. I really appreciated that. I think another big issue that we're dealing with in American Christianity is the epidemic of biblical illiteracy, both within and outside of the church. So obviously, if you don't go to church, everyone thinks that they know what the Bible says and what's in the Bible, and they're all wrong because they've never actually sat down and read it. And I've had that conversation with people outside of the church a million times where they start asking me questions. And I'm like, that's not even the right question to ask, and you gently try to lead them towards the right questions because it's about reshaping their paradigm. They have a paradigm about the Bible and what it means and what it says that's been given to them by American culture that does not reflect what it actually is. But that's also at an epidemic level within the churches as well. And I think that we don't even have a common biblical vocabulary as American Christians. And so it's very hard to get people to start thinking about their faith and buying into discipleship in a biblically substantial way because they're just illiterate. So what do we do about biblical illiteracy, and how do we help engage people that literally know nothing, or even worse, that know like all of the wrong things about the Bible?
Yeah, I think, and again, I do think cross-cultural ministry is a place to go for this because there are a lot of people in the West, outside of the West too, but we're talking about the West. A lot of people in the West that they have that exact issue. They'd go to a people who had never heard anything about the Bible. And it's like, okay, how do I approach this? What's that book? It's it was popular in the 70s, Peace Child. And there was another before that. But part of the deal was the guy told the story about Jesus. And when he talked about Judas betraying Jesus, this tribe was like, yeah, we are Judas people. That's amazing how he betrayed this guy. And he realized, oh my gosh, that was something that this tribe valued. And so they got the wrong story. So it wasn't until this tribe had a war with another tribe and then he found out that one of their traditions was that one of the ways to stop a war was that one tribe would offer a child to be raised by the other tribe as a way of stopping war and bringing peace. And then he's like, oh my gosh, now I know how to talk about the gospel. God giving his son. That's going to totally relate to them. So I think one of the big things we have to do is to start with, with the issues, the thoughts, the mindset of the people that we're talking with. What are their assumptions? What are their questions? What are the things they're interested in? All of that, and figure out how do we talk about our faith in a way that connects with those issues so that they see value to it. I think one of the things that we can do out of our frustration is just come at them and say, really, you're going to throw at me the idea that one of the ones that drives me crazy is like, okay, you're going to say God is bad because he asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It's like, have you ever read the story? Have you ever? I even saw it in Bones, where like that show Bones, the woman's supposed to be this genius anthropologist, and she brings it up as a big counterclaim to Christianity. You're like, sorry, it just showed that you're not nearly as intelligent as you think you are because you've never read the story and you don't know how it works within the wider picture.
Right.
But it's like, we can throw stuff at them, but I think the more important thing is to figure out what are those connection points with our culture today and with Christianity. And it's probably going to be something different than what we expect it to be. And then build on it there. But the other thing I wanted to say, this is maybe a little more practical. Don't warn anybody that says they're going to read the Bible not to start at the beginning and try to read through. Please don't do that. I would have people, for example, I would encourage people, if they've got a good sense of humor, I'd say read Jonah. Because Jonah's just crazy what goes on in Jonah. He's such what do they call the alternate? There's a word for it. Anyway, but he's like the non-prophet. It's like he does everything wrong. And it's the pagan ship guys that are like, hey, what does God want in this situation? Yeah, I mean, it's like, wait, they're not supposed to be seeking, so it's all turned upside down, and it's 4 chapters. So it's totally doable for people that like shorter stuff. It's not that long. And if they just read that, or if like Ruth, the story of Ruth is so powerful, and it's so, it talks about faithfulness in terms of between humans, just commitment to one another, and how things can work out. And, so I would urge people to start with stories like that if they're trying to figure out what the Bible is, because those are easier for us to read, rather than, telling them, well, start with Genesis and read through, or, hey, read the book of Revelation. It's like, no,
Right.
wait on that one for a while. It's like that one is hugely helpful, but just don't start there. And so that's the other thing I would maybe even like, the other thing that, like, if I was going to do Jonah was, let's say I had a friend who's like, look, all right, I'm willing to read something in the Bible. I'm totally skeptical about this, but I'm willing. What I would do first is print out Jonah without the double stuff of Bible passages and no rice paper and all, and get rid of all the verses. Just print it out as a story, just take out the chapters, verses, and just print it out and say, hey, let's read this together, and then let's get some coffee and talk about it. Because that's the other thing is a lot of people that aren't used to the Bible, it's like, why all the verses? What's up with that? And why all the chapters? And why is it printed in 2 columns on a page? I mean, it's an odd thing for people. And so we don't get rid of all of that, just let them read the text, and then I think, just having those kinds of discussions with people can help people to start to see the value of the Bible. It's like, oh, I didn't know there's actually, you can laugh when you read the Bible. Like, well, yeah, this part of Jonah's pretty funny. He does this great little psalm in the belly of the whale or the fish, or what, and then he's vomited out on the beach, aren't we supposed to laugh at that? I mean, isn't that funny? It's funny. It's like, wow, okay, the guy got vomited out on the beach. Wow, okay, and then his little temper tantrum at the end of it. It's like, I told you were going to save people. I can't believe you did that. And then the worm comes, eats. I mean, it's just, anyway. I could go on and on about that, but that's what I want people to see. The Bible is something you can read profitably for your entire life. You will never finish what's in there for you, but it's old. It's far older than People magazine. It's far older than whatever it is you read. It's older than Marxism. It's older than, and so you're going to have a little patience with it, because it wasn't written for our fast, hey, I'm going to get this done, right here. And the other thing is people can read Proverbs really profitably too, if they're given a way to do it, which that's one of the chapters in my book as well, is to start interacting with God in your reading of the scriptures with the book of Proverbs. There's a way to do that I think it works for people. So anyway, so I would say, first part of what I said, and then the second part is just help them know what to read, because otherwise they're just going to get the bizarre stories, and, oh, that's a bizarre story. How can I believe any of that? And it's like, fine, but can we just look at some other stuff first and then we'll go back to that? Or do we have to start there, So.
Yeah. Before I start asking you about solutions, which you've already hinted at quite a bit of solutions in just what you've been saying about the decline of Christianity in the West, but I got to ask about Christian nationalism. Now, I've done a lot of work on Christian nationalism on the show. It's actually been kind of an obsession, and my audience understands that I've done and said a lot against Christian nationalism, but my general take on Christian nationalism is that it is a response to traditionalists that have stayed within the church, that understand that the church is in decline and want to use the power of the state to salvage it. Do you think that there's something to that Christian nationalism in a lot of ways is a response to the decline of the church? And what do you make of kind of that trend within Western Christianity?
Well, I mean, the first thing I find odd is that there's apparently this growing voting bloc that's worse than Al Qaeda, according to a Democratic strategist. It's worse than Al Qaeda. It's this growing group that could just overthrow our democracy, and yet at the same time, Christianity is in massive decline. So I'm trying to put those two things together. Like,
It's a
how does
good
that
point.
work? And prior to Christian nationalists, and it's still around, were the other term for bad Christians prior to that was evangelicals, which I found upsetting because I felt like what they were talking about was fundamentalists, but they were calling them evangelicals because they don't know the difference.
Yes, yes.
And then prior to that was the fundamentalists with the moral majority, which, some of the political cartoons when the moral majority was out and had some power was that they were the Taliban, they called it, like the television Taliban. And it's just so there's a part of me that is skeptical about the concept just because I feel like it's another fear-based approach to try to get people to vote for certain people. And I'm not saying, I think leaders on all sides are playing the fear game, and it's really the lowest level of leadership, but that's kind of where we are right now. So I would be skeptical about it just because it's rather timely that this is building as we're moving toward the elections in November. And I'm sure it's going to get louder and louder and louder. But, and again, you live in a different part of the U.S. than I do. I'm in a part of the U.S. where there isn't a Christian nationalist. And if they put a bumper sticker on their car, they would probably be killed.
Right, yes.
You would never even do, I wouldn't, not that I've wanted to, but I wouldn't wear a MAGA hat around here. I
Right.
would get the crud beat out of me. So the part of the country I'm in, there are no Christian nationalists in LA as far as I know, but the fear of Christian nationalists is huge. Huge in this part of the country. And so again, that makes me skeptical. It's like, well, maybe you've got more of them in your part of the U.S. That's possible. My dad's in Texas, and we talk regularly about he sees the extremes on the right, I see the extremes on the left. But I would want to say, so number one, if Christianity is in massive decline, but there's this thing called Christian nationalism that's growing, then that would make me want to emphasize the nationalism part more than the Christian part. That it's almost like what we're talking about is people who want it to be like it used to be in our culture. They don't necessarily go to church. They may not know the Bible at all. But what they're interested in is, let's get this country back to the way it was when I understood it. And so I would tend to emphasize the nationalism side of it and say that it's a reaction on the conservative side to a lot of the pushing that's been going on with the Biden administration. And again, I'm not trying to be political. I'm just trying to analyze. But I think there has been an agenda that's been pushed very hard in the West and definitely in the U.S. with Biden as president. And I think one of the reasons that Donald Trump is a potential, candidate is because people want somebody to kick back hard on that agenda. Is that wise? I don't think so. Personally, that's not a really wise way to approach the situation, but I get why people feel that way. And then I also get why people on this side of the political spectrum in LA, when Trump was first elected, there were parents at the elementary school where my kids went. They were physically sick. They were physically sick. Like this is. It was amazing to see. So I see it as balled up in all of that, and I think of it as more of a nationalism thing than a Christian thing. Because at least my interaction with Christians, I don't see the Christians I know, and again, maybe where I live, I don't see them as super organized. I see them as upset and angry. I don't see them like getting together and coming up with some sinister strategy to take down the country. And again, maybe that's happening in other states. I don't know. So that would be my tendency, would be to emphasize the nationalism more than the Christianity, because I don't know that many Christians that when they see that the church is in decline, they get angry. what I see is when people see the church is in decline, they start getting confused and they feel stuck and they don't know what to do because the church isn't working. And so it more stalls them than energizes them. Whereas I think there are a lot of people energized politically to do some really radical stuff because they think the whole society's, we're terrible or something. I don't know. I mean,
Right.
my problem is I lived in Mozambique when the average salary was $200 a year after their civil war, which was horrendous. I've lived in Zimbabwe under Mobutu and his dictatorship, and I come back to the US and it's like, yeah, we got issues, but good grief. This is like, I mean, living here is a cakewalk compared to how most people have to live. And so I'm not as eager back to deconstruct. I'm not as eager to deconstruct everything because I don't think there's a happy place that human communities automatically have. To me, it takes a lot of work to get to a happy place as a community. And so the idea of let's take it down and make it better is really, that doesn't happen historically. I'm pretty sure I'm on good historical ground there. That just doesn't happen. So let's adapt and change. Yes. And if anybody's thinking I'm going to be a Christian nationalist because the church is in decline and I hate this, the way that this country's been led the last few years, don't go down that path. There's a lot of more fruitful paths you can go down in this time that might actually result in something good. But if we're thinking of just either ripping apart people on the left or ripping apart people on the right, that's not going to go well. It's not.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think so much of this conversation has just been dumbed down by the media. I mean, really, for me, Stephen Wolfe, in his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, has I think his is the most consistent summary of Christian nationalism because his perspective is self-consciously as a Christian nationalist. So it's a definition of the term from somebody who is a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist. And the interesting thing about his definition of Christian nationalism is it's not the same as what the left applies to Christian nationalists. Yes. And then I go to kind of like I would say we're a center traditionalist Nazarene church, and there are people in my church who would consider themselves probably Christian nationalists, but what they mean by that term is not what Stephen Wolfe means, and it's not what the progressive media means. So I completely agree with you. I think a lot of it's just scare tactics by the media. I think one good thing that all Christians in the United States should do is just to be skeptical of the narratives that are coming out of right-wing and left-wing media. I think that really is doing more to drive us apart than any objective reality. So I'm really glad you set it up that way. We got a couple of minutes left, and I think we've built this conversation to the place where we can now respond to that. So obviously, given the fact that the church is in decline, you've done a great job of outlining some of the factors and even hinting at some of the solutions. How do we as Christians respond to the decline of Christianity in the West?
I think the most important thing that we can actually control is our own lives. The close relationships we have, whether it's with family or friendships or working relationships, and then the local community we live in. And my view is that if we will put our time, talent, and treasure into those areas, we're going to see the most fruit. The way that I look at it is that in this generation, our job, we're really seeding the future church. We're planting seeds among people, among our children, among in our communities for whatever the future church is going to be. Because it's not, it's like if you just, another kind of interesting way to go through the Bible is just look at what was the structure that God's people used for their worship and growth together. And even you've got a tabernacle, and then the tabernacle ends when Jerusalem takes over, and then you've got a temple. And then, theologically, when Jesus comes, it's pretty solid theological ground that he kind of replaces the temple. So there's all this institutional change that's already happening. But notice the reason they went from a tabernacle to a temple was that they were nomadic with the tabernacle. So that totally made sense when you're nomadic. But then when you ground yourself in a particular place, then you establish a temple, and And then for us as Christians, I think since we're called to proclaim the gospel, to everyone, because everyone can choose to be a part of it, then there's going to be a lot of different structures. So that means that in our day and age, we're used to a particular kind of church, but that isn't the only kind of church. I mean, it's kind of funny when you look at like Calvinists or Presbyterians versus Methodists versus Episcopalians in the battles over what's the right kind of church. When they start using the Bible, all of them are super selective, and
Right.
it's just like
Right.
none of them fit exactly. But it was, really important for them to ground the structure they were committing to in the scriptures. I get that. But to say we're the only one that's got it right biblically is a problem. So all that back to we're seeding the future church. The work that we're doing now that'll be most fruitful is to plow up the fallow ground, plant some seeds, and for me at least, I'm thinking it's the next generation that's then going to start to say, okay, now how do we begin to structure things for the rhythm of life that we're in right now? So, it's a long-term project. It's not going to be, you're going to get to have a huge church necessarily. I mean, you can do a mega church while you're doing that if you want. There's plenty of them in certain parts of the country. But it's going to be more about everyday discipleship. It's going to be more about just doing faithfully what's in front of you, relating to people. And here, these are two key things. Actually living out the forgiveness and the reconciliation that's a part of the gospel, and really being gutsy and working hard to forgive and be reconciled to people. That's a huge thing that we need in this society today. And then I'm, experimenting with gathering some friends together at different times to eat a meal and read the scriptures and sing some hymns or worship songs or whatever, and just talk about how are we doing in our faith, kind of back to the whole Methodist approach, but just scaled down and do that on occasion. It doesn't have to be every week or every month or whatever. Just get together at different times and encourage each other in your local stuff, and let that be enough. We don't have to do the big, huge structural things right now. I mean, I'm hoping there are people still involved in trying to figure that out, and I'm not against that. But I think every Christian should really start with, what's your orbit? How do you live out your faith every day in that orbit faithfully? And let that be enough for now. And then we'll take the next steps when we need to take the next steps.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to pastors and other church leaders who are trying to navigate this cultural reality? And then on top of that, if somebody outside of the church puts their faith in Christ, how do we nurture them so that that faith grows and doesn't die after a couple of years?
Again, I think, to me, when people come to faith, they need a mentor, someone that they click with. And it may take a few tries, and that's okay. But to find somebody that they click with that is willing to kind of meet with them on a regular basis and just walk through life and faith with them. I think that's the critical piece, that even when our churches were working well, that was where a lot of the discipleship was happening. It wasn't necessarily programmatic. It was those one-on-one relationships that people had over a period of time. So I do that for sure. For pastors, I think it's a very tough situation. Now, if you've got a really old building, you may need to think about letting go of the facility. And I know that's really hard to do. One odd idea, but it's one that's, has borne some fruit out here. You can actually lease your property to some companies that are very interested in lucrative church stuff. They will overhaul it for either housing, some local need like housing or whatever, but you still own the property. And then you've got regular income coming in to support your creative ministries. That's a really different world than being in a building that you're not sure you can re-roof the thing and it needed to be re-roofed 10 years ago, or your air conditioning or whatever goes out and it's a massive expense and you don't have it and you're fretting over all of that. And you're using your facility a very small percentage of the time in a given week. So I think that's one of the key things that, is what are you going to do with your building if you've got one, and if that's part of your problem, you've got to solve that problem. What are you going to do? We even started renting out our facility more and more because space is at a premium. But then we ran into another problem, which was our session. They were not building managers. That's not why we called them. That's not what they were good at. But they started having more and more issues with the people that were renting from us. So if you're going to go that route, you probably need to develop some kind of corporation of people or hire it out to somebody that knows what they're doing and can handle that stuff, because it's going to knock you off of your focus for ministry. So the other thing I think that we really need to think about, and this is even harder than the building, do we have to worship every Sunday? Now, I know some people would, and it's fine. If you disagree, no problem. But we put so much of our time, talent, and treasure into worship services every Sunday. And I think at some point we've got to start to put a metric to it and say, what's the point of this? And is it meeting that need? If it's meeting that need, if you've come up with a really good way to measure whether this is doing what it's supposed to do and it validates your use of funds, great. But I think we're way past the time where we can just, first thing, let's do a worship service. It's like, well, okay, but why? What's the point of this? What are we after with this service? And then how do we justify? I mean, because so many people, their time, how much time are we requiring of people in our congregation for worship? I mean, I'm just talking about the worship leadership or the choral groups or whatever. That's what they do. I know people in choirs, that's their whole service to the church. They go to choir practice and they sing, and they're good Christians. Well, I'm not saying they're not good Christians, but I'm saying the whole of the Christian life is not singing in a choir. I mean, that's a good addition, but it is not what Christianity is about. And there's a lot more to it. So to me, that's the other thing we've got to figure out is what do we do with our worship service so that the worship service is actually empowering our people to live their faith out in their everyday lives in communities that more and more don't really know what Christianity is. And they're not going to come to our worship services, because we've got a really good organist or because we got a great worship band or that it's like they'll be happy for us, but they're not going to go. So
right.
I think those are two essential issues. If you have a building, what are you going to do with the building? Think of it short and long term. And is this more of an albatross around your neck? Even though you love the place, I totally get that. But is this serving your ministry? And then the other is, what is our worship service about? And how do we streamline it, if nothing else, so that people have more bandwidth for discipleship and for being out in the community and representing Christ in civic groups and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, it's very easy to become pessimistic about the state of Christianity in the United States, but what are your thoughts on that? Are you optimistic about the future of Christianity? Where do you think that we're headed?
Yeah, well, again, globally, I'm super excited about Christianity. I can't, there's already some theologians, like some African theologians and Asian theologians that are really interesting to read, like how they're living out the faith in their context. There's a lot of great stuff out there for that. So I'm super excited about that. Within the West, I think that what I'm most excited about is the discipleship that can happen in coffee shops and in relationships with one another, and that families, because what you talked about with your friends, I know many people that have been very dedicated to their faith and very dedicated to the church that are totally distraught because their kids are not, they're either not interested or they're anti-Christian, and they don't know what happened. But my sense is that if we really spend time developing our family as a place where Christianity happens, that's the primary place. And then the church supplements that. I think that bodes well for the future. Because again, I think we need to think about seeding the future. It's not like we're going to turn this thing around in 5 years. I thought I'd turn the whole church around in 5 years when I started as a redevelopment pastor. Again, that same consultant I mentioned earlier just started laughing. He's like, 7 years if it goes absolutely perfectly, which it never does. Said more likely 10 to 12 years to turn a church around. Well, a lot of the churches I know of these days don't have 10 to 12 years. They don't. So we got to step back and say, okay, that's probably not going to happen. So let's invest in families. Let's invest in individual discipleship, and let's train people to live out their faith in their everyday lives. A great book for that, by the way. A lot of people have heard of the Brother Lawrence practice book. There's another one. If that one doesn't quite float your boat, there's another one that I fits me better. Which is the Sacrament of the Present Moment. You got to get the one translated by Kitty Muggeridge, but it's the Sacrament of the Present Moment. And the whole discussion there by this French priest working with nuns, I love that too. It's like absolutely nothing related to my life.
Right.
But this guy speaks right into my heart in terms of how to live out faith faithfully, moment by moment and day by day. And that's something I have total confidence that regardless of what happens with the Christian church in the West, that if we live that kind of practice of the present, just in the present moment, what's God calling me to do? What do I do next? We're going to be good, and God will guide and direct us to wherever it is that we need to go to make good happen, in the future. So I would just scale it all down. At the scale down level, I'm very confident. At the level of our congregations, or even the higher levels from there, when you're, like for Presbyterians, there's the presbytery, and then there's the synods, and then there's General Assembly. I'm not confident about the future for those structures. I think, in the 80s, we thought about getting rid of synods in the Presbyterian Church, but there was a pushback because 2 synods still worked well out of the whole country. So we kept them all. Those things are going to start to disappear. But again, discipleship's not going to be, discipleship can happen with or without those institutional structures. And that will continue. And families, Christian families can work with or without those structures. So focus there, and I think you're going to be good to go, regardless of what happens with the bigger. But again, I totally support people that are continuing to try to plant churches, redevelop, that are working with the mega churches. All of that needs to happen. I see what I'm doing as supplemental to that, not in any way kind of criticizing them or saying everybody should be doing what I'm doing at all. But I think all of us should be doing the discipleship in our families and personally in our everyday lives. That always should be the case, no matter how many Christians there are. Because in many ways, I'll wrap with this, many ways, Christianity is less complicated when it's in the minority. It's when it starts to get in the majority that you get a whole host of new problems and issues and challenges. But when it's in the minority, Christianity's done very well in the minority in different countries and times, again and again and again. And it will do fine. It's just not going to look like we're used to.
Yeah. Well, I got one final question for you. And I apologize I did not send this over beforehand, but I'm very interested in interdenominational conversation and dialogue because even though I'm kind of my background is in several different churches, so I'm truly like a product of an ecumenical environment. But I am very interested in why people subscribe to certain denominations and what they find appealing about it. So you are a Reformed Presbyterian. So I want to ask you before you go, what do you find appealing about the Reformed tradition in general, and then Presbyterianism in particular?
I like you, I grew up in multiple churches. My family tree goes back to Disciples of Christ, ministers. I was baptized in Lover's Lane United Methodist Church in Dallas, Texas as a kid or infant. I've been involved in Evangelical Free. I was in a Nazarene church in Mexico City that I was working with a pastor there. So I've had a wide range of experience, and my family's kind of this ecumenical across the board kind of thing. So the reason I chose to be Presbyterian was because of Reformed theology. In discussion with a lot of some seminary profs and things, as we talk, they're like, you should look into Reformed theology. You're kind of Reformed in the way you're thinking. And I think a big part of that was that I'm really interested in the social structures, in the social impact of Christianity. And I feel like Reformed theology has tried to work at that level quite a bit. And so there's a lot of resources there. That may sound odd given what I've just said about we got to scale it all down. But
I get what you're saying, though. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really that more of a let's think about this at a societal level that I really like. And the other thing I like, and this is just a prejudice of my own, but I like people that are trying to grapple with deep intellectual issues. And a lot of the people that I read that I was like, wow, this person's got something to say, ended up being Reformed or Presbyterian people. And so it just, I think they just kind of spoke my language and that's why I thought, but that didn't solve the whole problem because you've got the PCA, you've got the PCUSA, you got the EPC, you got a new one called ECO. You got all sorts of stuff out there. And so you have to still choose. And one of the, I actually chose the PCUSA because I wanted a broad, nationwide, crazy kind of diverse denomination and deal with those issues. But the thing that's happened recently, though, is that with ECO, taking many of the people that would be evangelical in the historical sense, not in the media sense, but taking most of those churches, the PCUSA now is really far to the left. And I'm not sure, it's been a pendulum through U.S. history. I'm not sure if the pendulum's going to swing back or not, just because there aren't many people left that are either on the right or center right. Most of them are gone. So I don't know where it's going to go in the future. And it's just changed. And I know there are a lot of other mainline denominations that have experienced that same change. And so it makes it hard to feel as excited about the possibilities through the denomination as I did when I was ordained initially, So, but I still, I do think broadly I fit within the Reformed stream of things, but I'm not limited. I definitely love reading stuff outside of that. Yeah. So, there's a group I got together with that's a great group. They're reading Reformed theology. But one of the things I realized is that I really I like combining odd things and seeing what comes up from it. This group, the way we read a lot of stuff, it was more like, okay, here are the confines of Reformed theology. So how do we strengthen those? They wouldn't call it this, so maybe it's unfair, but the confines. And I was always thinking like, oh, this is sort of interesting because, if you look at like the Nazarenes, there's sort of an interesting connection here. Or look at the Methodists. Oh, that's kind of cool. Or, and then I'm also, I fully recognize that globally it's the Pentecostals that are way outpacing everybody.
Yeah.
So they actually are more representative of global Christianity at this point than any of the options I considered from my upbringing. And so I guess I definitely still feel like I'm pretty Reformed in a lot of ways, but I guess I hold that identification more loosely just because, honestly, I don't know, it's kind of like the Christian nationalist thing. I'm not sure what people hear when they hear Reformed or Presbyterian.
Right.
It could be 20 different things. So I'm not sure it's a useful label anymore. And even the Christian nationalists or evangelical or fundamentalists, it's like you can use that term, but you don't know if it's conveying what you want it to convey. You got no idea because, so yeah. So I would definitely say that's where I am. That's been a great place for me for a long time. I'm still there theologically in a lot of ways. But yeah, I'm not sure how well the label works anymore in our culture.
Yeah. Well, Randy Lovejoy, I really enjoyed talking with you today. Before I let you go, where can people find and follow you?
Yeah, again, on Substack, it's Make Good Happen with Randy Lovejoy. We're also in development of a website at randylovejoy.com. And then I'm also on Instagram, the Lovejoy Collective. Somebody else already had my name, so Lovejoy Collective, and Facebook as well, Lovejoy Collective. And then I'm working on a book, again, outside of the church, inside of the faith, which should be coming out later this year on Amazon. My first book's already out there, which is God in La La Land, which is just kind of looking at Christianity in this city. That's already out on Amazon, and the second book will be coming out later this year. So yeah, that's where we are at this point.
Hey, well, Randy, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciate it. And it's great talking with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.